kind of start with there, man. Like, you're a pastor and, you've been doing this for a while. And I guess kind of what is your view of horror entertainment or media as a whole?
Well, we probably need to clarify what we mean by horror. Most people, especially the uninitiated or those who are antagonistic toward the genre, they don't know what it is, to be honest. They have something in their mind.
Okay, yeah.
They think horror, they think hostile, what people would typically call torture porn.
Yeah.
Or they think a slasher movie. Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees. That's their conception of what horror is. And that's not what horror is. Those are examples of horror, but the examples are myriad and they vary greatly. Mm-hmm. The word horror is an old French word, and it means to shudder, to tremble, to bristle. And as a genre, it's really horror is generally a story or a storyline, so this relates to gaming as well, that frightens, thrills, or creates a real sense of dread in the person through conflict with either danger or evil. People argue about like whether it has to be supernatural or not. But you've got all kinds of subgenres within horror, right? Survival horror, slasher movies, satanic horror, monster movies, alien movies, zombie movies, ghost movies, right? There's all kinds of horror movies, and they're not always, and they're frequently not bloody and gory. Sometimes they are. Sometimes disgust is an element in horror, but not always. Other times, some films are more Hitchcockian, meaning that it's very much a thriller with horror driving it, and the violence is almost off screen. Some of my favorite movies are that way. Some of my favorite movies are definitely violent, but some aren't. So I think people need to understand that horror in and of itself is an experience, right? And you just use your I'm going to date myself. I was going to open up your concordance. People don't use those anymore. But search your Bible app for the word horror in any translation, and it's all over the Bible. Because it's talking about a sense of dread or despair. So I think, from my perspective, horror as a genre, whether that be in film or in a game, is a way of telling a story. And some stories are horrific. Some stories, some games are life is sometimes horrific. Horror is a part of life. And so it has to do with, how you engage it, how it's presented, how it's packaged. All of that really matters. And so that's why you do have some very talented Christian people in the horror industry that are doing it really well.
Okay, man, I honestly didn't even know that there were some Christians even in that field making movies and things like that. Do you know of any off the top of your head that they've made?
The biggest name would be Scott Derrickson. Now, Scott Derrickson, a Sinister. Directed Sinister.
Really?
He directed Hellraiser Inferno, which features the lead character whose name is Joseph Thorn. Anywho.
Oh.
Yeah, he's a bad guy in hell.
And we've got him on the podcast, I guess.
He did the Exorcism of Emily Rose, and he's even recently done some, I think, Marvel stuff, which I don't pay any attention to. I ain't got time for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those are he's a professing Christian, and it's interesting to hear him talk about things like violence and blood and whatnot, the horrific elements in movies. From his perspective, at least in two of the interviews that I read with him, he talks about how it's supposed to repulse you. You're supposed to go, ooh,
correct.
It's, if it's horror, now if it's a horror comedy, then it's different, right? They play with it, and that's what makes it funny because they're doing the opposite of what you're intended to do. But like if you watch something like No Country for Old Men, which isn't a horror, it's a thriller, but boy, it's pretty horrific. And it is a violent movie, but it doesn't glamorize it. It shows you the ugliness and the pain and the despair that comes with violence. So yeah, there are Christians that are actually doing some good works. And then there are Christian authors. I've never read his books. I think Ted Decker is a Christian guy that writes Christian horror.
Yeah, I used to read some of his stuff in college, actually. I really liked it, like 3 and House, and what was it? The Showdown was another one. He had some. I really got into his books around that time. Yeah,
so I think horror has a place. It's like anything, though. Like it's like your diet of entertainment or recreation should be varied. There should be some variety there. And when it comes to recreation, I mean, it's that should be a smaller part of your life rather than the whole. And so if your recreation tends to, I mean, I don't think a week goes by in my life when I don't watch at least one horror movie. I mean, the last horror movie I watched was an old Hammer horror movie. It was Dracula in the UK. It was called in America. It was called like the Fear of Dracula, or the Blood of Dracula. I can't remember. It had a different name, but it's Christopher Lee playing Dracula.
Right.
Anyways, I tend to favor those things, but that's not the steady diet of everything that I take in for entertainment or recreation or whatever. So I think horror has a place. You just have to understand what it is. And then I know one of your listeners wrote in a question about, well, shouldn't we draw lines? Where do we draw lines? And of course, that is important to do in any area of our lives. So that's a part of the equation, but nothing wrong with horror as an element of entertainment. And I think there's a lot of the reason horror is useful, and I'll stop talking here. But the reason horror is so beloved is not because we have a culture of death that's obsessed with evil. That's our fundamentalist talking. There is an element of a culture of death. That's for sure in our culture. I mean, we murder the unborn. There's a lot of evil that happens in the world, but there are other reasons why horror is so embraced by American culture and not just American culture, but I know American culture, and that is because it is in many ways cathartic, helpful, not just entertaining. But that's another subject.